Have you ever heard the glockenspiel? How about the flexitone? A cabasa, perhaps? I assume that the answer to these questions is probably a yes for most of the audience. However, many of you wouldn't know that you've heard them because they're so little known to the public. As a percussionist of 8 years, I've dedicated a large portion of my life to practicing these fascinating instruments, and it just breaks my heart to see them go unrecognized for all that they do in music. Percussion is a major aspect in nearly all of music, and there's so many interesting types, and they're seldom mentioned despite their unique songs and styles. Even the well known instruments, such as snare drum, have unique spins to them that most don't know. Music is a form of art, and learning to appreciate all aspects of it is important. It can also be really fun and interesting to learn what instruments are used in all your favorite songs. I wish to introduce you to all types of percussion instruments, from the heavy hitters, literally, of bass drum and snare drum, to the large, beautiful mallet instruments that I specialize in, and even the minuscule finger cymbals and their friends in the auxiliary. Starting off, we have main percussion. In main percussion, I dictate as snare drum, bass drum, cymbals, and toms, all the things used in a drum set. First is the snare, probably the most basic and well-known percussion instrument. It's used to keep the beat, and it is very simple to understand how to play it. And with me I have pictures of all the instruments and the sounds that they make. The snare drum, despite being so simplistic, is still one of the most complicated instruments to learn, with extremely difficult rudiments to learn. Next up is the bass drum. It's probably the most simple percussion instrument that there is. It's like a big punching bag. It's deep, the sound it makes is deep, and it's often used to keep the beat in music. There is a drum set variant that is much smaller and makes a much higher sound, and you use your foot to hit it. The cymbals have many variants. The most common one, and the one used in the drum set, is the suspended cymbal, which can use all forms of different mallets or drumsticks to hit, whether you're rolling it or tapping it. And other forms of cymbals include crash cymbals, the hi-hat, which you control with your foot, just like the bass drum in the drum set, and even finger cymbals, which you hit up and down like this with a little string attached to them. As you heard, the sound is much more high-pitched and metallic than the other instruments listed in the main percussion. Lastly, the toms. Probably the least used in most music outside of a drum set. The interesting thing about the toms is that they have different pitches depending on how big the drum you used, and they often come in pairs of twos. And that finishes off the main 4 drum sets. Moving on to my personal favorite is the mallet instruments. Mallet instruments are unique among percussion instruments in that they use traditional notes as opposed to just being a singular note for the whole instrument like snare, bass, or toms. Starting off, the xylophone, probably the most well-known mallet instrument, is made with wood, and those tubes right there, they're called resonators. They're small. The ones on the xylophone are smaller than most others, as it has a less booming sound. The xylophone is probably the most versatile and used in the most music as it can fit most scenarios. Next up is the glockenspiel, or bells, easier. They are metal, and they're the smallest mallet instrument among them all. And they have no resonators because since they're metallic, they already ring out quite loud and long. They are often used in Christmas music, but they are also almost as used as the xylophone. Next is my favorite instrument of all time, the marimba. It's massive, and it's made of wood just like the xylophone. However, its resonators are so much bigger, and the wooden notes are much larger, and it makes a much deeper sound, which I think sounds amazing. However, since the marimba is much deeper, it is less often used for melodies and more often used to keep the beat. Next is the vibraphone, the most complex of the mallet instruments. It's almost a mixture of all the other ones. It has large resonators like the marimba, not as large though. It has metal notes like the glockenspiel, and it's about the same size as a xylophone. However, the vibraphone has two very unique things to it. It has the pedal, which lets you determine whether or not the notes will ring out. And most interestingly, it can actually be plugged in, and inside of the resonators are little circles that will spin, and they will make an interesting sound that you'll hear now. The wow 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 sound. Lastly, in the mallet instruments are the chimes, or tubular bells. They are the most unique mallet instrument in that they are vertical and tubular. They also have a pedal, like the vibraphone, to determine whether or not something will ring out. And like the glockenspiel, they're used a lot in Christmas music. However, due to their powerful sound, they're often used in powerful parts of music. The most interesting thing is that you use a hammer to hit the chimes. Not a literal hammer, more like a plastic mallet, like an actual mallet as opposed to the circular ones used for most other instruments. And that brings us to all 5 of the mallet instruments. Lastly, I would like to cover auxiliary, the most varied and interesting and difficult to explain types of instruments because they're so unique compared to everything else. So I'd like to list off some of the noteworthy ones that I find most interesting. Starting off, like mentioned in the intro, cabasa. It's a cylinder instrument that has a handle, and it has a bunch of metal beads on a string. And the sound it makes is also quite interesting. You take your hand and you rub the metal beads against the bumpy texture to make that noise. Next, what is probably the funniest instrument in my opinion is the flexitone. It is literally a metal slab with mallets attached to it that you shake. And it's often actually used in horror music. And honestly, I'm not feeling too well. I think I might have a fever. I'm gonna need more cowbell. Cowbell is pretty well known because of the famous SNL skit, I Need More Cowbell. The next instrument is very complex. You see, it's a triangle. It's a metal triangle that you hit with a metal bar. It's very complicated, I know. And then lastly, we have a brake drum. I would just like to ask, what do you think an instrument called a brake drum could be? If you guessed the brake drum that's actually just a car part that you hit with an actual tool belt hammer, you'd be right. You hit this with a hammer, an actual metal hammer, and it's pretty fun. You can literally pick one of these up at an auto parts because it's a car part that we just use as an instrument. And then a lightning round of some more auxiliary instruments. There's bongos, you hit them with your hands. A bell tree is a bunch of upside down bowls, metal bowls really, attached to a stick, and you just rub a metal mallet against them. The wind chimes that flow when you touch them. The wood block is just a block of wood with an indent that you hit. The maracas, very well known, you shake them. There's so many auxiliary instruments, it would be impossible to list them all here. And it's just so fun to learn them all, and it's sad that they're not known, because music wouldn't be music without the percussion. It adds so much texture to the music, and without it, the music would be lifeless. I hope that I've taught you something new about percussion that will enhance your appreciation for music, percussion especially. And I have a challenge for anyone listening, is to go find some music, some of your favorite music, and see if you can pinpoint some of the percussion instruments you may not have noticed before. It can really make music feel special when you can appreciate all parts of it. Thank you.